Hey, what's up guys, in this video we're going to talk about HTML input attributes. So inside the HTML form element we have the input element, and the input element has so many different attributes. So first of all we have the value attribute. So the value attribute specifies the initial value for the input field. So we can have the initial value, and the initial value will be shown inside the input field, and then of course we can modify that, or we can delete that completely and we can write our own text. And next we have the read-only attribute. So we can write read-only, and the read-only attribute specifies that the input field is read-only. So once we have made the input field as read-only, then we cannot modify the value. And next we have the disabled attribute. So the disabled attribute specifies that an input field should be disabled, and a disabled input field is unusable and unclickable. And next we have the size attribute. So the size attribute specifies the visible width of an input field, and it is usually in characters, and the default value for the size is 20. And next we have the MaxLength attribute. So the MaxLength attribute specifies the maximum number of characters allowed in an input field. And also we have the mean attribute, and also we have the max attribute. So the mean and max attributes specify the minimum and the maximum values allowed for an input field. And next we have the multiple attribute. So suppose we have the input field, and the input field takes the file as input, and now we can use the multiple attribute. So the multiple attribute specifies that the user is allowed to enter more than one value in the input field. So because of the multiple attribute, now we can browse the files and we can select more than one file. And next we have the placeholder attribute. So the placeholder attribute specifies a short hint that describes the expected value for the input field. So we can say enter name. So the placeholder attribute hinting to enter name inside the input field. And also we have the record attribute. So the record attribute specifies that the input field must be filled out before submitting the form. So because the input field has the record attribute, so we must fill in the name before submitting the form. And next we have the step attribute. So suppose we have the input field which takes number as input. Now we can use the step attribute and we can set one step, and by doing that, so every time we increase the value, it will increase by 0, 5, 10, 15, and this way the step size will be 5. And next we have the autofocus attribute. So the autofocus attribute specifies that an input field should automatically get focus when the page loads. So whenever the page loads, then the input field will automatically get the focus, and that is because of the autofocus attribute. And also we have the height and the width attribute. So the height and the width attribute specify the height and the width of an input element. And next we have the list attribute. So the list attribute refers to a data list element that contains predefined option for an input element. So we have the data list element with all of those options. Now we can add some ID to the data list, like my list. Now we can bind the data list with one input field. So I'm going to create one input field, and now we can use the list attribute of the input field, and we can bind the data list and the input field. So the ID of the data list should be the value of the list attribute of the input element, and this way the data list and input field will be binded. Now whenever we type inside the input field, then we can have the suggestion of the options. And next we have the autocomplete attribute. So the autocomplete attribute specifies whether a form or an input field should have the autocomplete feature on or off. Like an example, we have the input field. Now we can use the autocomplete attribute and we can set the autocomplete on or we can set the autocomplete off. Now the autocomplete allows the browser to predict the value based on earlier typed value. So these are all the available attributes of the input element, which makes the input element very much useful and important. So hope you understand the concept. We'll see you in the next one. Thank you.